Hello everyone, this is Noor Musa.
I'm Alana Travers.
Welcome to Confused Iraqi. So today we'll be talking about growing up in Iraq during this time post-2003 war, living in the aftermath of the war up to 2012. And during that time I finished my primary education, secondary education, and I went to college. However, Iraq was going through intense dynamics. 2003 war, it wasn't like only the few weeks of the American invasion, it was only the few years after, and probably still continuous, that people had to deal with the sectarian conflict, instability. But for me, I would want to talk a bit more about the experience of growing up in Najaf during that time, and hearing stories and reflecting from family members who lived in Baghdad, and the news obviously on Baghdad. I don't know if people know, but many Iraqis would remember, especially the one who grew up in Baghdad, that Baghdad was a very dangerous place to be during that time between 2003 and 2012, I would say. Explosions all the time. It wasn't a safe city to be, and people still think that Iraq is not a safe country. And finally, this is changing, but I would say basically it's because of that time, that dark time where many people lost their lives, many people lost their livelihoods. Iraq just became a dangerous place to be. So after 2003, as I said, in Najaf we didn't feel the war, but what we felt is the few months after the war when during the Iran war, many Shia elites, they had to leave the country because they were opposing Saddam Hussein. So some of them, like Al Hakim family, they went to Iran. Muqtada al-Sadr family, they also were assassinated. So he's one of the survivors who returned. Hakim, they returned. Other Bahr al-Ulum.
Yes, and this was all under Saddam, right? We should say.
Under Saddam Hussein, they had to flee the country, and many of them were they lost family members because of that. Yes, but the ones who survived and they came after 2003 to retake their position.
And this is actually, if we could just quickly explain it, this is the period, right, in which politics of Iraq really shifted. Because on one hand, you've got the US, whose kind of stated role in the US-led coalition coming to Iraq was to get rid of these weapons of mass destruction, right? They realized they weren't there. And then you could sort of see the narrative shift from talking about, trying to rid the country of weapons of mass destruction to imposing a democracy or bringing rights for women and that kind of thing. That was definitely what was said internationally, and it would be interesting to talk about that. And just as an aside, it's interesting to compare the percentage of women parliamentarians at the time. Of course, you could say under Saddam, I think there were 34% of female MPs. Okay, let's be real, they probably weren't standing up against him, sort of rubber stamping. But now the Iraqi parliament has about 5% women. It's like you can sort of see how that hasn't progressed as much. But anyway, I digress. We also see the beginnings of the new Iraq constitution in this time, 2005. I think we can talk about the referendum that there was over that. And also, like you just mentioned, the beginning, the rise of sort of Shiite politicians. And of course, also we have Al-Qaeda and more extremist groups flourishing in this time. So there's just so much going on. And then also the sectarian war that you mentioned. And I don't even know really where to begin, because you were also just growing up as a child in this period. I wonder whether we could talk a little bit to start with about Najaf. You were talking about how you lived there primarily in this period because it was safer. I mean, do you remember Muqtada al-Sadr in your childhood, the Mahdi army, how things kind of developed?
Yes, so growing up in that city during Saddam Hussein time, we weren't aware of these big families, their influence, what had happened to them. So it was surprising for my generation to see these leaders coming back, taking what is right for them, but we didn't really know about them much, to be fair. So seeing that people were just making a huge fuss in the street on TV that Muqtada al-Sadr is going to be on TV, he's going to give a speech. And my question was, who's Muqtada al-Sadr? Many people knew who's Muqtada's family. they are one of the biggest families in the country. They are actually one of the only Iraqi Shia clans. It's usually the others are from different countries. But I didn't know. Many of my generation, they didn't know. Many Iraqis didn't know what is going to happen. So Muqtada Sadr announced at that day something that changed, that actually changed a lot in the upcoming events that we had to experience. He announced Jaysh al-Mahdi military. So in the Shia belief...
And this is the in the West, it's known as the Mahdi army, the militia, right?
Yes. But what is Jaysh al-Mahdi? So in the Shia belief, there are 12 grandsons of Prophet Muhammad. And al-Mahdi is the last grandson. And Shia, they strongly believe and support Prophet Muhammad family. While Sunnah, they acknowledge that and believe in it, but then they also acknowledge his consulate, his consular, his friends, where Shia don't really actually acknowledge the friends. We call them Sahabis, friends of the Prophet, the one who supported his regime and then followed him after his death. So that's the difference. For Shia, it's only the family of the Prophet. And the last grandson, who in the Shia belief has actually disappeared and will appear one day. Will come back one day to save humans, is al-Mahdi. So Jaysh al-Mahdi is, in concept, is the military that is going to support al-Mahdi return. So Muqtada Sadr, that day, he was in al-Kufa mosque.
And this was pretty soon after Bush announced the success of the invasion, right?
Yes, exactly. Things were quiet, not much has happened. And then everybody exactly was saying Muqtada Sadr is making an appearance, he's announcing something, nobody knew what was it. And he gave his famous speech on that day in Kufa mosque, and he announced Jaysh al-Mahdi.
Right.
I think he did mention the agenda, like for Jaysh al-Mahdi in his speech, but people were a bit surprised of the actions they were taking.
In summary though, what did he want? He was trying to get rid of the US presence?
Exactly, and just ensure that Iraq is governed by Iraqis. It was a militia that protects Shia.
Yeah, when he says Iraqis, presumably he doesn't mean all Iraqis. Right, he means Shia.
The action speaks more than words, and what Jaysh al-Mahdi did was a bit surprising for many Iraqis. There was lots of bloodshed. What happened is the few weeks after that announcement, he opened volunteering to Jaysh al-Mahdi, and then people joined mainly because this is a Sadr family speaking. People didn't know who was Muqtada. They was like, this is from this family, we follow. And many people joined, and that's when I started to realize that it's actually become a fact that Najaf wasn't safe for weeks after that. Because what Jaysh al-Mahdi started doing is assassination campaigns of al-Ba'ath leaders, people who were managing the city during Saddam Hussein, especially the people who were in the military or in the police. So there were these famous on motorcycle assassinations. So Najaf became a very dangerous city to walk around, so people just stayed home. Funny enough, during the war, school stopped for a few days, weeks, but during that time took the longest time for it to stop.
Yeah, it was interesting because he said Najaf was safer than Baghdad, and I mean, my God, if this is safer than Baghdad, what's going on in Baghdad? Because it doesn't seem particularly safe.
No, but that also was a very not safe time for Najaf in particular compared to other cities, because that was the only organized thing that was announced at that time. And that probably kicked out the idea that more organized armed groups should start appearing.
Yeah,
and that did happen. Najaf wasn't safe, assassination happening, people stayed home, couldn't go to school.
The following year, we had the battles for Najaf, which was sort of US troops predominantly. I don't know whether you remember anything about that.
I don't really remember more of that. All I remember, interestingly, probably something did happen and I wasn't aware of it, is that few weeks after the announcement of Jaysh al-Mahdi, they were a bit shocking for us.
But the following year was also very intense in terms of military.
Definitely. See, the thing is, when the 2003 war happened and all of this Iraqi military weaponry was left.
Yeah.
People robbed that, and many Iraqi families started having weapons. And then a religious leader announcing a military to fight the occupation, which means all of these recruiters already there, and they already equipped with the arms they need.
And it's interesting to me as well because, again, it'd be nice to speak maybe a little bit about what's going on in Anbar and Ramadi at this time, and the Al-Qaeda increase. But going back to what was happening in terms of politically in Baghdad and the US, what do they call it, the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, they were working on a new constitution, and there was a governance council that sort of shared power in this time. And I'm curious about what your family's thoughts were, or whether people were talking about this sort of discussions about a new democratic system while all of this sort of chaos was going on around you as well. I know it doesn't fit terribly neatly into the chronology, but yeah, what are your memories of that? Do you remember the constitution and the conversations leading up to it? And of course we should say that Muqtada al-Sadr also then sort of switched to taking part in this system as well, so it's not a very black and white issue.
Yes, it's very complicated time. You don't only have Muqtada al-Sadr militias doing on the ground campaigns, armed campaigns,
violence, assassination,
and disruption. Yeah. You also have Ba'athist military leaders not having a job anymore, or wanting to defend the previous regime, also disturbing the peace process. And then you also have these how do you call them? All of these Iraqis who were lobbying for the war, and then they seized the opportunity that it did happen.
To come back in and take part.
Yeah, exactly. And now there is an opportunity for them to be part of the change, and then also be part of the change in the leadership positions.
And we're not even talking about Kurdistan at the moment as well, which is also...
No, but then Kurdistan also was part of the conversation, because now they also can be part of the new system that Iraq is trying to figure out. It was confusing for Iraqis, I would say normal people, to see who are these people. Some of them we are aware of. We knew that they were opposing the opposition, and they had to flee the country, and Saddam Hussein did harm them and their families, and they were under threat. So we were aware of some of them, and these people are coming back. They would be probably equipped to lead the next stage, and some we weren't familiar with. But they all came with something. They all came divided.
Can we explain perhaps a little bit about how the country is sort of split in terms of, different ethnicities, I guess?
That's the tricky part. That what happened there is actually what caused the divide in the country. These people came with the different background that they come from, and they wanted to support the people from their background. They didn't look at it as a new Iraq. They're already thinking that we should divide the country to Sunni, Shi'i, and Kurdish.
So Noor, you're from Najaf,
yeah.
Shiite area. Sunni areas, kind of Ramadi, Anbar, sort of specifically, although also other parts of the country, of course. And then Baghdad is predominantly Shia, South, Basra, and Kurdistan region, of course, Kurds, essentially.
It's not only Sunni and Shia.
No.
There are also different groups within these groups. So when you say Shia, you have Hakim supporters, you have Muqtada al-Sadr supporters. Same for Sunnah, you have different groups. These groups within themselves, they wanted to also take as much as they can.
Well, yeah, and we should mention Kurdistan as well. There's a bit of a divide.
You have the two different parties also.
Talibani.
That was, I would say, the challenge, is that it wasn't looked at as this is time to come together and shape the Iraq that we want for everyone. It was a time on how do we divide these resources, how do we grab that power. And so Iraq was heavily divided at that time. we couldn't say like there is a Shia group, and Sunni. Even within these groups there was a division.
And we should make the point, I guess, it's obvious to us, but maybe people miss it. Within these groups there were just ordinary families, people, children, parents wanting to get on with their lives, right? A lot of this stuff, a lot of this political divide and then violence, conflict, death, it wasn't from families, ordinary people.
From my point of view, and this is point of view, this is probably not the reality, but from my point of view, and I think this is the sad part, the Iraqis who experienced the war and who lived during Saddam Hussein time, when they saw these figures that they had hope in them in supporting the country, they saw them as closer to them because of connection in a religion or in a location.
Tribal,
So they were easy to be attracted to them, and unfortunately used by them. Used for wars, used to be recruited and to be used in armed conflict. And that's sad for me. Because Iraqis didn't have that before, that division, and then they wanted something for themselves. Is that these persons who came with that ideology that I want power, I want to be part of the shape that the country is going to have, and I already have the spaces that I can control. And then Iraqis themselves become divided. They weren't, but they became divided because of these individuals. And that's sad, because that impacted many people's life, where their community, their neighbor is not safe to them anymore, because their neighbor is from a different religious group or from a different background. So then they had to take matters into their hand, where they had to use violence against someone in the community, only because that person who had this political ambition wanted to get as much power as they want. So that is a bit sad, to be honest.
And also, of course, the influence of the coalition on this divide. It comes a bit later, but the Anbar Awakening, maybe we'll talk about it quickly now, was also heavily influenced by US cash and forces trying to kind of cement their stronghold over, the west of Iraq, essentially, and you can just begin to see how all of this influence is connected and not always in the people's best interest.
Yeah, I would say, even on a personal level, exclusion is a very difficult feeling to deal with. So many of these groups who had to deal with that, it was mainly because they felt excluded, and there were more influential groups that took more control and influence on other groups.
And what was access to information like at the time? Media, accurate reporting?
That's a challenge. That's very big challenge for Iraqis. Especially social media started also to grow a bit later on. That time it wasn't at the beginning, but then later on.
Yeah, well, by the time of ISIS, right, you get it already.
Yeah,
it's
at that time. Yeah, exactly. But then before that, information sources, we didn't have a national TV. They started after we established the government. They started the Iraqi network, media network. Again, biases to the government, and people didn't have that trust in an already divided government. So the government was basically divided in its principle.
Can we talk about the governance council? And would you be able to summarize? I know we're trying to cram a lot into this podcast, but the 2005 constitution and roughly what that was, some of the key parts, possibly like just the divisions of power, and then how it went to public vote in the referendum and how that was, and
So this is the thing. The people who worked on this constitution and Bremer and the Iraqis that formed this committee, they were already from different backgrounds. So they were representative, but again, they weren't voted for. So Iraqis who had lived the war and experienced Saddam Hussein time during his presence weren't part of that process because they didn't elect these people. These people were already picked. They had previous experience, like being part of opposition system, and then they didn't want Saddam Hussein, and they worked on it for years from the state, from the UK, so they were close to these governments. But again, they were imposed on Iraqis. Iraqis didn't vote for these people. So their plan was, we're different. How do we ensure every group has what they want? And that was the main principle. It's like, we're already divided, how we divide.
Yeah. And sort of the power sharing structure, sort of. Maybe you can talk about that quickly.
So they did develop the constitution. Iraqis went and voted for the constitution in 2005. Again, that was the only option. Because they wanted stability.
Although of those who voted, it's about 80% voted in favour.
Yes, but it's 2 years after a war. People want stability. The constitution means a government will form and Iraqis will have a saying. So all these 2 years, they didn't have saying in anything. They didn't vote for anything. This is the first time they voted for something. They wanted the constitution. The constitution made sense to them. But then they wanted what comes after the constitution, being able to vote for the new leadership.
Right. First election. So the first president of Iraq, Jalal Talabani from Kurdistan, and the first prime minister, Ayad Alawi.
Yes.
Okay. And he had a quite short-lived premiership, but then we had Ibrahim al-Jafari, and then of course 2006.
Noor.
Yeah, which was a longer period, and under him, well, things were objectively not great at all.
Yeah. That's when things got a bit tricky. People didn't look at these persons, like the prime minister or the president, as people with experience, as the human who's going to lead. They looked at them as people who belong to a certain group. So Alawi wasn't wanted because he wasn't representing the majorities of Iraqis and was challenging for him. So his government was challenged.
And by convention, we should say now that the president tends to be, or has to be, Kurdish, prime minister Shia, and the speaker of parliament is Sunni, right?
Yes.
But explain a little bit about Alawi. Why wasn't he accepted?
So this was the first government. And Alawi didn't resonate with the majority of Iraqis, the Shia, as the leader who could represent them and lead the country. So his government was challenged by different Shia groups, by also different Sunnis. So he wasn't able to lead peace building in the country. And then things were a bit clearer after that the next prime minister has to be a Shia leader and has to be acknowledged by the Shia majority as someone who could represent them and lead them. And that was a very critical thing for Iraq. That's when it wasn't about the person, it's about them proving to be representative of their affiliation.
And then after him, Noor al-Maliki.
Yes. Ibrahim Jafari, and then Noor al-Maliki. And Noor al-Maliki is one of the strongest Shia leaders when it comes to having the belief in himself as a Shia leader, not as an Iraqi prime minister.
No, and
it comes with our priorities. So
okay.
That was a very critical time, because the priority wasn't that this person now is a leader for all Iraqis, what actually their agenda should be.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about the sectarian conflict, the sectarian war? Talk to me about your experiences of that, because I mean, again, I have to say this is a period of Iraq that I know far too little about, and it's something I'm really trying to rectify, because it seems to be that in this mess, in this chaos, that so much of the current issues and divisions, problems, even personal animosity towards people was really set and rooted. And I should actually just say really quickly for listeners, there's this really interesting book that I've just been reading called Muqtada al-Sadr in the Future for the Battle of Iraq by a guy called Patrick Coburn, who has written some fantastic books and was in Iraq at this period. And again, this is, I'm speaking as a Westerner for a Western audience, but it really does set out a lot of, that I think as an outsider looking in, you can look at the storming of Parliament even this year or a couple of years ago by the Sadrists and just think, what on earth is going on? And it can seem so completely alien to anything we are used to. But actually this book and this narrative helps explain why people are so personally tied to these leaders. And yeah, it's. I just recommend that. But of course, we shouldn't. We really need to address the fact that this was a really deadly time for Iraqis.
Yes.
And
it's horrible times. You have people just running away to different parts of the country, trying to find refuge, running away from their neighbors. It's not safe to go to school. It's not safe to go to work. You never know if the explosion is going to happen here or there.
And when exactly was sort of the peak of this time?
It was definitely after the government was formed. It was when things really peaked. Explosions almost on daily basis. Baghdad was a very difficult city to move around. Many people just preferred to walk because it takes an hour to go anywhere. It became very heavily secured, trying to secure it, but failing to.
And so this sort of conflict started after the government was formed, right?
Yes. It already was shaped before that, though. It was in a form that people wanted revenge, because that the previous regime had some leaders and people wanted to revenge that. And then it was usually, as I said, used by political parties to try to enforce their agenda, disturb peace in certain locations, and recruit people. So it got actually escalated when politically the agenda was a bit clearer now, where there are now political parties forming in the country, agendas forming, elections happening, and parties wanting to have more influence in the country. That's when it became a bit more organized. Before it was, as I said, Jaish al-Mahdi doing their assassination campaigns, different groups revenging for what is happening. It was an exchange of a bloodshed, and Baghdad was the main spot. It was difficult. I remember the areas around Baghdad being very bloody, and people just didn't want to go to Baghdad just to cross these areas. So one time during all these years, I only been to Baghdad twice, and one year my mother took me because she was still her family was still in Baghdad. They are still living in Baghdad. So we were going from Najaf to visit her family. It's been years. That was my first exposure to Baghdad after 2003. I would say that maybe that's in 2006, 7.
Okay.
So I went there, and the car was stopped in Latifiyah. And Latifiyah is one of these areas where people, hearing in the news on daily basis, people being kidnapped and found killed on the side of the road.
And at this point, it was because of the Sunni Shiite.
Yes, it was mainly.
And it was
Sunni
personal
Shiite.
as well. It wasn't politically driven, like political parties. It was individuals, right?
People revenging. It's just people revenging for losing someone, doing the same thing to the other group, and just it was actually called, and still called, killing based on ID.
Yeah.
They read your name, they read your tribe, they read your location. I was like, okay, if you are from the other side, you're being
And
killed.
this is when you have stories and horrific accounts of people having 2 different IDs to try and just cross a checkpoint and showing the wrong one and getting killed. And actually, it just seems completely unfathomable. I wonder what it was like to be a young girl growing up in this context.
Just hearing, my mother family is a huge family. She has lots of brothers, they have sons, and then just the idea that they rather not to leave their area. Even Baghdad, that is a big city. You can just change locations, and there are different lifestyles in different areas. They just rather to stay in their own area. Similar people, it's a bit safer. Having to have sometimes another ID when you go outside of your area, just in case you have a Sunni ID and a Shia ID. So in case you are stopped at a fake checkpoint somewhere, you just show this.
Did you have
other
2
ID.
IDs?
In Najaf, it was fine. That was mainly something in Baghdad.
Well, I mean, I guess in Najaf it's obvious, right?
Yeah,
You're a Shia, you can't get away from that. But how did you feel as a child? Do you remember feeling scared? I mean, were you sheltered from it?
We were shocked that this is Baghdad. This is happening in Baghdad, and it's not war, but it's just people taking matters into their hand. So it was the idea of going with my mother to Baghdad was very scary to me.
Yeah.
I really miss Baghdad. I love Baghdad. There is this arch when you arrive into Baghdad that says Baghdad welcomes you. It doesn't say Baghdad actually. Baghdad's old name was the city of peace, the house of peace, the home of peace. And it says it welcomes you. And I love that arch, just crossing that arch. And for years I haven't crossed it. But then I was terrified from the idea actually going there. it's just, you have to go there, stay in your area. There are forbidden neighborhoods to go because they're completely Shia Sunni neighborhoods. Why would you go there? And then same for Shia neighborhood. Why would a Sunni go there? Otherwise, they are risking their lives. So it was a difficult time. But I remember even it's not only this difficulty with exchange with people on daily basis and having these differences, but then also just main roads weren't safe because of all these bombed cars and all of these helicopters flying around, just knowing that there is a conflict happening.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask you if we could, I mean, I really want to know more about this, but maybe we should just address the other thing, which is that, of course, the troops were still there till 2011. So, I mean, did you see many more US troops, or were they kind of relegated to the green zone and then, you know, out on location as and when? Like, was there still a strong military presence in your childhood during this time? What are your memories of that?
I remember that Najaf wasn't safe for the Americans, so they left their bases after the war, very soon after the war, and they gave it to another.
I mean, sorry to interrupt.
Coalition member. I think El Salvador and other coalition members were in Najaf, and then they also had to leave. It was only mainly around the Anbar area, Basra, and Baghdad areas, trying to be a bit away from the city.
It's really interesting to have your experience, because I've spoken to a lot of different people about how just their childhood growing up, most of our friends came of age in this period, and I've never spoken to anyone who grew up in Najaf, right? And it's so interesting to me that your experience of this time is relatively peaceful.
Yeah.
And I feel like we almost need to counter this by saying, like, it's because of the control of the Shiite in this area. Like, it wasn't, and of course that, I mean, again, I wasn't there. I'm not Iraqi. I can't really comment too much, but other parts of the country had it so terribly, and I'm thinking particularly of Ramadi, and even Basra. I think I spoke about it on the last podcast, but this is sort of the predominantly British area. And I was in Basra a couple of weeks ago, and it was for an entirely different article, which still hasn't been published. I need to chase that. But anyway, it was about history and looking at the sort of the development of Basra as a city, and I spoke to a few people there just kind of anecdotally about how it was during the war. I should say the 2003 war, and you know, they said that the British troops there destroyed the city, and their experience of that time was deeply horrific, and even the years subsequent. I think the last British troops withdrew in 2011. And of course, the Americans did too, but kept a presence, which only left earlier this year. So, and now it's, you know, it's training and advising and assisting and that kind of thing. But of course, they have still a huge influence. Let's be honest. So, anyway, I can't remember what my point was. I think it was about the military presence, and you didn't experience much of that.
We saw lots of it on TV in Baghdad, but in Najaf, again, I haven't seen it. But to go to Baghdad from Najaf, you have to go through Hilla, Babel.
Yes.
And they were in Babel.
Right.
And there was this very dangerous checkpoint between Babel and Baghdad. Mm-hmm. And there was a horrific explosion once there. Not hundreds. People died, I don't know, but it was a big number. And my father used to go on that checkpoints on a regular basis. Yeah. Many people used to use that checkpoint. Of course,
and also for people who don't know Iraq, there's a hell of a lot of checkpoints, and you can't just get around them. You have to go through them. You have to speak to people, show your ID. Often, if you're a woman, you have to get mildly harassed, and then they let you through. So there's really no choice to it.
And usually in these checkpoints, you have American bases around. So they are targeted. Mm-hmm. And then something also else to mention here, which is very important, I think, which is also very sad, to be honest. Yeah. People who had to join the new Iraqi army, mm-hmm. Because they were trained by the Americans and they had to work with Americans, they were somehow targeted too. Yeah. So many of the attacks that took place in the country did target Iraqi military and police men, only because they were affiliated to the state. Yeah, which is very disturbing and very sad. They were fellow Iraqis who'd rather joining the system.
Yeah.
But yeah, the American military presence, I was only lucky that I grew up in Najaf that I didn't see it, because I know in other parts of the country it was a bit intense. The raids in Baghdad, the raids were horrible for people. Many people who lived in Baghdad, they were annoyed that the American military just go walk into their house, do their regular raiding and just go around. Again, a Muslim country, hijabi females, people protect their families in a way that it's very disrespectful to have foreigner men just going in. There's so much that has happened that made people a bit angry.
Yeah, well, of course.
Angry.
And I'm thinking also, again, anecdotally, I've just had so many stories of families not being able to leave their home for a year because there's suddenly a US military base on their street, having to build tunnels between other houses so they can go and get food from one of the few shops that's open. And then, of course, if anyone finds these tunnels, you look like a freaking terrorist, but you're just a family trying to get access to medicine or food, or, you know, and then, of course, when you've got sort of suddenly the rise of Al-Qaeda there, you know, people using your roofs to take aim at the military base. What are you going to say? Get off my roof? No, because you get shot too. It's this awful thing of civilians being in the middle as they so often are.
Yeah. And we weren't sure what was happening with our oil. We weren't clear on what is happening to our institutions, to our money, to our gold, to our museums.
Yeah. Well, actually, maybe this is a really good point as well to, you know, Iraq, we haven't mentioned it yet, but I think we should be pretty frank, is incredibly corrupt as a country. Its money just goes like that. Yeah. It's theoretically one of the richest countries in terms of oil revenue, but does not translate to the million people displaced or the hundreds of thousands of people living in tents, and the children who don't have education have to sit on the floor, and the people who go to hospitals and don't get the medicine they need. The sort of systematic looting of the state kind of began in this period, right? And
exactly. It was, again, because there was a division and it was all around distribution of resources. It became systemized. This corruption became a bit systemized, acknowledged as way of working. I mean, this is how these organizations should operate. So they are able to fund political parties and armed groups.
And it's quite crazy to think that next year marks 20 years since 2003, and so little so much has changed, of course, and we'll talk about the developments in ISIS and in future episodes, but so much of that sort of corrupt system and mentality has remained the same. And I just wonder whether you have anything more to add about your personal experiences in this time and, of course, the country.
Yeah. There is just, I would say, from this period, there is just so much confusion, so many horrific things had happened that helped shape the present context. However, one thing that we should also pay equal attention to is the losses that Iraqis has experienced, especially human losses. Many innocent people were killed during that time for, I would say, being in the wrong time, in the wrong place, or being born with a certain name, given a certain name or background. And these are not the individual that we lost that we should grieve. We should grieve. It's the family members that they left having to deal with their loss.
Yeah.
I remember in Najaf, in my school, we had lots of people coming from Baghdad because Najaf was relatively safer, so lots of people fleeing the situation coming to Baghdad. There were many girls who lost their fathers. So their uncles were like, it's not safe to stay in this neighborhood, just go to Najaf, go somewhere else. And these girls had to deal with it for the rest of their life. And the story of losing their father, their brother, their uncle.
And slot that also into their own understanding, right? People meaning for things, right? And when something bad happens, just psychologically, it's kind of human nature to want to have some sort of explanation. And it must just have been impossible. How do you put any sense to this?
In my family, let's just try to answer this through one example. So in my family, I had a cousin who used to sell books in Mutanabbi Street. Have you been to Mutanabbi Street? You know what is Mutanabbi Street?
Amazing street.
Yes. So it's one of it's the only actually famous book market street in Baghdad, where people go there to read, relax a bit, drink some tea, exchange some poetry.
It's right on the Tigris. It's really gorgeous.
And stories. And he just was there selling books. An explosion happened in that road.
Yeah.
In that street, and he lost his life. He had 2 children, very young children, who have to grow up losing their father for no reason. When I think about it, why did we lose Haider?
Yeah.
And let's assume he's a Shia guy selling books in that road. I'm sure there is also a Sunni guy in that road selling books.
This was 2009, 2010.
Yeah.
Under Malik.
So it wasn't about being Sunni or Shia or being named in a certain way or where you are from. It's just trying to disturb peace. It's trying to violence. It's just trying to limit people's ability to live in a stable context, to be able to make their own choices. And again, this is the point. Iraqis and choices, being able to make choices. This is a very strong point to reflect on, because even making the choice to survive has been taken away. So how about choices, simple choices like being able to choose who represent you and choose them for the right reasons? That's what's definitely manipulated. And then we are living the consequences of that. So it is very sad that this happens in my country. And in Iraq, it's not only a country for Iraqis. It's a very historically is a very rich country that contributed a lot to humanity, and definitely stories like that also influence how things are going.
And just to sort of wrap up this episode, I'd be interested to know your personal view on this question, which is something I know is heavily discussed, and I mean, I'd be really curious to know what you think. What were the mistakes made by the coalition, the provisional authority, those who came in and tried to solve the issues, and I say that in quote marks. What did they get so wrong?
I think what they got so wrong is trying to again impose something on Iraqis. Saddam Hussein was imposing something. They were also trying to impose certain decisions on Iraqis. They were imposing certain Iraqis on Iraqis. So Iraqis' voice and will wasn't considered again. Same situation for them. Their opinion, the lives they want, the systems they want, were discarded.
And what would that have been? If we could envision this having been done differently or a different Iraq, I find it very hard to fathom what that could have been or what it looks like. Do you have any ideas?
I think this might sound naive, but I grew up in Iraq. I know the communities that we have. I know the people. And I think if it was left in the hands of our community leaders, our teachers, our normal people, and normal Iraqi people, Iraq would have been doing great. Because that's why we continue to go to school and to continue to live and be a bit stable while all of this madness is happening. Because majorities of Iraqis are peaceful people who want stability and progress. And that's why we are doing well now, actually, I would say, compared to all of the drama and what all of that mess that we went through. It's because we still have these people, this mentality, the Iraqi mentality, the peaceful mentality. We still have it. And I think if it was in the hands of Iraqis who experienced that war to make the decisions for themselves, things would have been much better.
Well, it's sort of the everlasting political question, isn't it? How on earth do you create a system like that? But I really enjoyed this episode. I liked the frank discussion that we had. None of us know the answers, and it's just an incredibly upsetting, interesting, oftentimes unbelievable period of history. And yeah, thank you very much for sharing your personal experience.
And I think we took a very big challenge here. We are trying to make sense of that
Unsensible.
Unsensible, exactly.
It's not quite a word.
So I think it's good that we tried, but again, so much happened there. There is good resources for people to explore with, to try to make sense of this.
Thank you so much again for sharing your thoughts.